What happens when the world's most controversial Duchess faces one of America's sharpest journalists under the glaring lights of live television? If you thought Meghan Markle's previous interviews were fiery, you haven't seen her spar with George Stephanopoulos until now. Because what started as polite conversation would soon turn into open hostility, leaving millions of viewers stunned and wondering if the Duchess had finally met her match. The morning sun poured through the towering glass windows of the Good Morning America studio in New York City. The set gleamed with its usual warmth, coffee mugs neatly placed, cameras humming softly, and a backdrop of Manhattan skyline glowing against a perfect blue sky. Producers dressed in their headsets and clipboards whispered excitedly behind the scenes. After all, this wasn't just any guest. This was Meghan Markle. Dressed in a sleek black pantsuit and her hair swept back into a flawless bun, Meghan walked confidently onto the set, her heels clicking against the polished floor. George Stephanopoulos rose from his chair to greet her, extending his hand with that practiced broadcaster smile. "Meghan, welcome," George said smoothly. "Thank you for joining us this morning." "Of course," Meghan replied, settling into her chair. Her tone was already slightly cool, though she paired it with the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Happy to be here." George adjusted his tie and shuffled his note cards. There was something in his expression that suggested he was preparing for more than the standard celebrity puff piece. "So, Meghan," he began, leaning slightly forward, "you've been in the headlines for years now. From your acting career to your royal marriage to stepping away from the monarchy to your projects here in the US, you've spoken a lot about your truth, but here's my first question. Do you believe your truth has ever conflicted with the truth?" The studio audience let out a faint murmur at the pointed question. Meghan's perfectly arched eyebrow rose as she let out a short laugh. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with irony, "I think people who spend their lives reading headlines and writing gossip columns love to talk about facts. But my experiences, those can't be debated. They're mine. My truth is exactly that, mine. Whether that makes some people uncomfortable, that's really not my problem." George didn't flinch, but he gave a faint shake of his head, clearly unimpressed. "That's an interesting answer," he replied calmly, jotting something on his notepad. "And what about the royal family? You've painted them as cold, even cruel in your various interviews." George continued, "but when pressed for specifics, names, dates, evidence, you've declined to elaborate. Some would say, that's convenient. Do you feel any responsibility for the damage your comments may have caused both to individuals in that family and to the institution itself?" Meghan's smile hardened. "Ah," she said, sitting back and crossing her legs. "Here we go. Another journalist trying to both sides racism and emotional neglect. Let me make this easy for you, George. It wasn't my job to protect the institution. It was their job to protect me and they failed." George kept his eyes locked on hers. "But Meghan, you also benefited enormously from that institution, didn't you? The titles, the platform, the global attention. Don't you think there's a contradiction in accepting all of that while simultaneously tearing it down?" Meghan's laugh was sharp this time, almost mocking. "Oh, George," she said. "That's such a tired narrative. People love to say she wanted the fairy tale but couldn't handle the castle. Please, if you think my life was some kind of charmed existence, you clearly haven't been paying attention." The room grew just a little tenser. George's pen hovered above his notes as he pressed on. "And now you're here in the US making documentaries, books, podcasts, telling your side of the story over and over again. And yet you still claim to want privacy. How do you reconcile that?" Meghan tilted her head, her lips pursing slightly. "I've said this many times, George. Privacy doesn't mean silence. It means control. I choose what I share. I choose how and when. That's called boundaries. Something the press seems incapable of understanding." There was a long pause. George studied her for a moment before setting his cards down entirely. "Fair enough," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Let's talk about Harry for a moment." Meghan cut him off with a curt wave of her hand. "Let's not actually," she snapped. "I think he's been dragged into enough interviews. This is about me, isn't it?" George raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching with the faintest hint of irritation. "Well," he said evenly. "It's about the story, and Harry is part of that story." "Harry is my husband," Meghan shot back, her voice sharper now. "Not your headline." George didn't break eye contact. "And yet you've spent the last few years making your marriage very much part of the headlines," he replied dryly. Meghan's mouth tightened into a thin line. "And what about your career before Harry?" George continued. "You were an actress on a moderately successful cable show. You've spoken about how proud you were of that work, and yet since marrying into the royal family, you've dismissed that time as insignificant. Do you look back on your acting career fondly, or do you see it now as just a stepping stone?" Meghan's laugh this time was low and incredulous. "You really do your research, don't you?" she said, her tone edged with sarcasm. I've always been proud of my work, but it's fascinating how people like you love to belittle it. What was it you did before this Clinton's communications guy? Now you sit here throwing stones at people who've actually done something meaningful. The comment was clearly meant to sting, and for the first time, George's expression flickered, though only for a moment. Let me rephrase, he said finally, his voice measured. Do you think the public's fascination with you comes from your accomplishments or from the controversy you've created? Meghan leaned back in her chair, her arms crossing defiantly. I think the public's fascination comes from the fact that I speak truths most people are too scared to say, and that clearly makes a lot of people, including journalists like yourself, very uncomfortable. George didn't respond immediately. He simply sat back, folding his hands in his lap. The corners of his mouth tightening into the faintest of smiles. And the tension between them, between a duchess who refused to yield and a journalist who refused to be charmed, hung heavy in the air as the cameras continued to roll. The air in the studio thickened as Meghan and George locked eyes. With every passing question, the warmth of morning television was replaced by something colder, sharper, a battle of egos playing out live in front of millions. And if you thought George was done pressing, you were wrong. The next round of questions would go deeper, cutting past rehearsed sound bites and straight into the heart of Meghan's contradictions, leaving even her formidable composure teetering on the edge. George leaned forward now, his elbows resting on the desk, his notes lay untouched, his eyes focused entirely on Meghan. Let's circle back, he said, his tone neutral, but his words deliberate. You've made it clear that you felt unsupported by the royal family. But what about the British people? Many welcomed you warmly in the beginning. Do you believe you let them down by leaving? Meghan's laugh was short and sharp. Oh, George, please don't act like the British press speaks for the people. If they were disappointed, it's because they believe the lies they were fed daily. I don't owe anyone an apology for walking away from abuse. George nodded slowly, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. Interesting, he replied. Because you often frame yourself as someone who represents fairness, compassion, even duty. And yet, some might argue that walking away from a commitment, even a difficult one, is the opposite of duty. Meghan tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. Do you mean to say I should have stayed in a toxic environment just to satisfy people's expectations of me? Is that what you'd recommend to your daughters, or is that advice only for women who marry into royalty? The jab was pointed, but George didn't flinch. He even smiled faintly. What I'd recommend, he said calmly, is being honest about your choices and their consequences. For a brief moment, Meghan faltered just enough for George to press on. And speaking of consequences, he continued, you've spoken about feeling unwelcome in the UK, even claiming you'd never feel safe going back. Do you really believe that's true, or is it possible you've exaggerated that narrative to fit the larger story you were telling about yourself? Meghan's lips pressed together, her hands clenching slightly in her lap. George, she said finally, her voice dripping with controlled disdain. Unless you've lived through the level of scrutiny, racism, and hatred I endured, I suggest you keep your theories about my safety to yourself, the audience murmured softly. But George didn't miss a beat. I'm simply asking the question, he replied evenly. Because the public deserves to know whether this is about actual danger or simply about preserving your image as the wronged woman. Meghan scoffed. My image? Oh, please. That's rich coming from someone who made a career out of spinning narratives for politicians. That struck a chord. George sat back slightly, folding his arms, his eyes narrowing. You're right, he said after a pause. I've worked with politicians, and I know how the game is played, which is why it's fascinating to watch someone like you, who claims to hate the media, master it so brilliantly. Meghan's cheeks flushed as she shot back. Master it? You think being vilified daily, watching lies about me go unchallenged is mastery? That's survival. George's eyebrow lifted ever so slightly. Survival that comes with multi-million-dollar contracts, magazine covers, and documentaries that happen to paint you as the heroine in every scene. Meghan leaned forward now, her smile icy. So, you're accusing me of what exactly? Taking advantage of my pain, making the best out of a terrible situation. I'm sorry if that offends your journalistic sensibilities, George. But that's called resilience. George tapped his pen lightly on the desk, his gaze unwavering. Or, he said quietly, it's called opportunism. The silence that followed was heavy. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Meghan's jaw tightened, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Careful, George, she finally said. You're starting to sound like one of those tabloids you pretend to despise. For the first time, George let out a low chuckle, though it carried no humor. And you're starting to sound, he said, his voice low and deliberate, like someone who's convinced the world revolves around her grievances. Meghan's breath hitched just slightly as her eyes flashed with indignation. That's enough, she snapped. You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. No, George agreed calmly. But I do know what accountability looks like, and so far I haven't seen much of it here. The tension in the studio was now unbearable. Even the camera crew had stopped moving, transfixed by the escalating exchange. Meghan crossed her arms defiantly and leaned back, her expression one of steely resolve. George, however, leaned forward slightly, his tone growing colder. And now he said, I'd like to ask about Harry. Meghan's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing dangerously. Don't, she warned. But George only continued. You've said that Harry supported you through everything, that he stood by your own, but some have said that he too seems isolated now, cut off from his family, from his country. Do you feel responsible for that? Meghan's laugh was harsh this time, more of a scoff than anything else. Responsible? Oh, how predictable. Blame the woman. Blame the wife. Because of course, Harry couldn't possibly make his own decisions. Of course, he must have been manipulated. How very 1950s of you. George held her gaze for a long moment before saying simply, I think the viewers can decide for themselves who's manipulating whom. The silence that followed was deafening. Meghan's eyes narrowed into slits as she whispered, You're unbelievable. George only straightened his tie and replied smoothly, And you, Meghan, are exactly who I thought you'd be. By now, the morning sun outside the studio was blazing. But inside, the chill between Meghan and George could have frozen the set. What was meant to be a polite interview had evolved into an intellectual cage match, and both combatants were unwilling to back down. And just when you thought George had exhausted his questions, he leaned forward with one last pointed inquiry, and Meghan's carefully constructed facade began to crumble in real time. George sat back, his hands folded neatly on the desk, studying her. You've spoken, he began, his voice calm but laced with steel, about how leaving royal life allowed you to rediscover yourself, your independence, your voice. But when I look at the years since, I don't see independence. I see a woman who traded one stage for another, one palace for another. Who's truly in control here, you or the narrative you've built around yourself? Meghan let out a humorless laugh, leaning forward on her elbows. That's rich. She sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. Coming from a man who's made his career telling other people's stories, criticizing them while pretending you're above it all. You don't know me, George. You don't know what it's like to have the world against you. George didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head, watching her with the same dispassionate scrutiny that had unnerved politicians and generals alike. I don't need to know you, he said quietly. I've seen this play out before, and I know what narcissism looks like when it's dressed up as victimhood. The word hit her like a slap. Meghan's eyes widened and her lips parted as though she couldn't believe what she just heard. Narcissism, she repeated, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. You dare sit there and call me a narcissist because I refuse to be silent about what I went through, because I refuse to let others write my story. George's gaze was steady, almost pitying now. No, he said, because every question, every criticism, every challenge, you meet it with indignation, with blame, with condescension. It's always someone else's fault. Always someone else who's cruel or ignorant or racist. But never you. Not once have I heard you say, maybe I mishandled that. Maybe I hurt someone, too. That's not strength, Meghan. That's denial. The air in the studio had gone utterly still. Even the faint hum of the cameras seemed to fade as Meghan stared him down, her jaw tight, her chest rising and falling with quickened breath. You think you're clever, don't you? She hissed, her voice low now, trembling with fury. You think you're exposing me, but all you've done here is prove why women like me stay quiet. Why we smile and while men like you try to tear us apart for sport. George shook his head slowly, his voice calm but relentless. This isn't sport, he said. This is journalism. This is asking questions that people are too afraid to ask because they don't want to be called cruel or misogynistic or racist. But someone has to ask because the public deserves answers. And what I see here, he gestured slightly toward her, is someone who doesn't have them. That was enough for Meghan. She pushed back her chair abruptly, the screech of metal against tile echoing in the dead silence of the studio. I don't have to sit here and be insulted, she snapped. I don't have to justify my life to someone who clearly came here with an agenda to humiliate me. George raised an eyebrow, his voice still calm. Not to humiliate you, he corrected softly. To hold you accountable, something no one else seems willing to do. Meghan stood now, straightening her black pantsuit, her chin held high despite the redness creeping into her cheeks. This was a mistake, she said, her voice trembling with barely suppressed anger. I thought this was going to be a real conversation. Instead, it's just another man trying to control the narrative. But George didn't move. Didn't even blink. No, he said simply. This was a real conversation. You just didn't like where it went. Meghan's hands clenched into fists at her sides. For a moment, it seemed like she might say more. But that she might turn back and launch one last cutting remark. But instead, she gave a sharp shake of her head and walked off stage without another word. As the sound of her heels faded into the distance, the studio remained frozen. George sat there quietly for a long moment, letting the weight of what had just transpired settle over the room. Finally, he turned to the camera, his voice low but firm. "To our viewers," he said, "I apologize for the abrupt end to this interview, but I believe you deserve to see these conversations for what they really are. Not just polished PR, but truth. Even when the truth is uncomfortable." He paused, straightened his notes, and looked directly into the lens, "and perhaps especially when it's uncomfortable." The studio air was thick, not just with tension, but with the realization that something historic had just happened on live television. Meghan was gone, but her words and George's unwavering questions still echoed off the walls of the Good Morning America set. And as George turned back to face the camera, one final cutting statement was yet to come. A statement that would set social media ablaze and leave Meghan's camp scrambling for damage control. For a long moment after Meghan's departure, George simply sat there, his pen lay forgotten on the desk, his notes untouched. The hum of the cameras and the faint murmur of the crew seemed deafening in the silence that followed her exit. Finally, he drew a deep breath, straightened his tie, and spoke not to Meghan anymore, but directly to the millions watching at home. "This isn't how I expected this morning to go," he admitted, his voice even and deliberate. "But sometimes conversations don't go the way we script them, and that's when the truth tends to slip through." He paused, letting the words settle, and the camera zoomed in just slightly, framing his expression of quiet resolve. "What you witnessed here," he continued, "was not a personal attack. It was not a smear campaign. It was journalism. It was holding someone who has wielded incredible influence, who has told her story on the biggest stages in the world to the same standard we hold everyone else to. And if that makes people uncomfortable, maybe it should." Behind the cameras, producers were already motioning at him, whispering about time slots and sponsors and moving on. But George ignored them. He kept his gaze locked on the camera, his voice growing firmer. "There's a difference," he said, "between being a victim and making victimhood your brand, between seeking justice and seeking attention. And I fear that distinction is becoming blurred. Not just here, but everywhere." He leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly as though weighing how far to push. "I want to be clear," he added, his tone softening just enough. "No one denies that Meghan endured challenges. No one denies that racism, cruelty, and scrutiny exist. And they can wound deeply, but what we cannot do, what I refuse to do is let those truths become shields that deflect any and all accountability. That's not how trust is built. That's not how healing happens." By now, social media was already on fire. Hashtags trending, clips of the confrontation circulating, some praising George's fortitude, others condemning him for perceived harshness. The studio's phone lines were lighting up. He glanced briefly at his notes, then set them aside entirely. "I've interviewed presidents," he said, "world leaders, generals, CEOs. And what I've learned is this. Power doesn't always come in the form of armies or wealth. Sometimes it comes in the form of a story, a narrative that people are afraid to question. But my job is to question it anyway." He leaned forward once more, his fingers interlaced now on the desk. "I hope Meghan Markle finds the peace she's looking for. Truly, but today reminded me why this work matters. Because if we stop asking hard questions, if we stop expecting honesty and consistency from those in the spotlight, we all lose." The control room queued up the next segment, a light-hearted cooking demo with celebrity chef. But George held up a finger, signaling them to wait. "And to our viewers," he said finally, his tone quiet, but unyielding. "Thank you for trusting us to have the tough conversations. They're not always easy. They're not always pretty, but they're necessary." He straightened his notes, gave a faint nod to the camera, and leaned back in his chair. "We'll be right back," he said, his voice measured, almost weary now. The screen faded to commercial. Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. Meghan had already left the building. Reports from staff said she'd declined the courtesy car waiting for her, instead storming off down the block with her team in tow. Her PR representative was already crafting a statement, likely blaming the interview's tone, George's questions, or the network itself. But in the control room, the producers were watching the live feedback pour in. Emails, tweets, viewers calling in, and the consensus was split right down the middle. Half praising George as a hero of honest journalism, half condemning him as a bully who went too far. George removed his earpiece, running a hand over his face as he stood up. One of the producers approached, a nervous smile plastered on her face. "You okay?" she asked softly. He gave a faint smirk. I've been better, he admitted. But I've also been worse. He gathered his notes, straightened his jacket, and walked off the set without another word. As he passed through the studio doors, his phone vibrated with messages. Journalists, pundits, colleagues, all weighing in already. But for George, the noise didn't matter. Not yet. Not until he'd had a chance to watch the footage back himself and decide whether he'd done his job and whether he'd done it well. Outside, the New York morning was blindingly bright. He slipped on his sunglasses and stepped into the street. In that moment, George Stephanopoulos was many things. Respected journalist, controversial interviewer, target of both praise and outrage. But above all else, he was unflinching. What did you think of this unforgettable interview? Did George cross a line, or did he simply do what others were too afraid to do? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the moments when the truth refuses to be polite.